So we're going to, we have a mic, and for which, okay. So we've got a half an hour for questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions, provocations, anything you would like. If you want to stand up, I'll repeat the question for the camera, because I don't know that we'll be able to hear you, and have at it, anybody who'd like to jump in. Yes, sir. Oh, thank you, Tracy.
Thank you. I just wanted one clarification. I know in the presentation, you said that it's the most educated generation. At the same time, I hear on education, 2/3 are really not qualified to enter society. So
yeah.
If we could maybe just
Sure.
the lineage of the time periods too.
Sure. I actually said best educated, and that's measured by the SAT scores for this generation, which are going up almost uniformly every year, and both in math and reading, or in English most particularly on the reading side. And there are more people taking that SAT test than ever before. The problem I alluded to and tried to clarify in my own presentation is that unfortunately, for those who are not taking SAT and who are not part of that college-bound ethic, the educational system that they're in is worse than it's ever been. And so it's a real struggle for them to get the education. But in the book, we talk about places where, for instance, African-American millennials in the city of Detroit put into a different educational system. 90% of them graduate, 90% of them go on to college. So it's not that the generation is not capable of all of them achieving that educational level. It's that they're being shortchanged by the educational system we're asking them to work in. And I know John would also want to comment on that, as the real expert who taught me everything I know on education.
And I learned everything else from Morley and Simon. So just two comments. One is on the positive side in education, I do think that it is true that there are more people graduating, more high school graduates, higher SAT scores, and at the sort of top end, a better educated society than we've been in the past. There also are examples, increasing examples of schools serving kids in poverty, where, as Morley alluded to, kids are getting exceptional results. I mean, demonstrating the incredible potential of our diverse society. There's a school in Newark that we work with where the college enrollment rates for a school serving all kids in poverty, college enrollment rates at this particular school are higher than any other non-selective school in the state of New Jersey. And so we're seeing incredible examples of that. And at the same time, it's the two big challenges, which are huge. One is that, as people in this room know well, in a new economy in this age, the skill levels needed are going higher and higher in order to be able to do well economically. And so even just staying the way that you've been before isn't enough to keep pace with that. So that's one gap that's growing. And the second, the gap, including by income and race, has not been closing. In some ways, it's been widening, and therefore the risks of our not closing the achievement gap for kids from low-income families and kids of color are great, and they're not making as much progress except in pockets, and the implications of not closing that gap are going to be huge. So we got rising tide in some ways, but we got to rise a lot more, and it's not lifting all boats.
I would add to that you see in terms of voter reg and voter turnout in this age demographic that there's a big drop-off when you look at those who did not attend college or did not graduate from college. Only 1 in 14 turn out to vote. So that's probably the largest discrepancy when you look at 18 to 29-year-olds. And I was with the executive director of Circle Research, and he was talking about how this is also one of those chicken-egg things where when we look at education and we look at where we put our focus on civic engagement, it's very often in the communities, in the schools, where kids are going to go to college and they are going to be able to talk with their peers and be targeted on campuses. And it's exactly with the demographics that need this extra push towards civic education that we're not doing it.
Yes, ma'am. Here, wait, Mike, because I know, but everything is now on YouTube forever, so you just want to make sure you're well represented.
Excellent.
On that, yep.
Also, as a member of the oldest part of the millennial generation and a former teacher of the youngest members of the millennial generation, one of the things that I have noticed is the battle really between the millennial generation wants to save the world, but as I've heard it said, we want to do it wearing cashmere, like that we really do want to we want to be engaged, but once you've engaged people, how then do you reconcile the fact that there is a material interest that they have as well in terms of economically sustaining themselves?
I guess without specifically asking your age, there is a phenomenon at the early part of the millennial generation and at the end of the Gen X generation. So you've heard Alicia refer to 18 to 30-year-olds. We actually don't believe people 26 to 30 are millennials. And a lot of people do. But the Strauss-Now theories and others suggest, certainly our survey research, that there's a dramatic change in the attitudes of those 25 and under from those 26 and older. And one of the attributes is the one you referred to, which is some people have called that 5-year cusp, and there's almost always this blending of generational traits at that point in the generational shift. Some people have called that the gold collar generation because they are very materialistic, very interested in consumer well-being, and very interested in saving the world. I hadn't heard the phrase saving the world wearing cashmere, but I promise you I will use it from now on. And that becomes less and less as that generation gets raised more and more by Gen Xers and less by boomers. Because every generation is raised half by one generation, half by the other. And the youngest part of the millennial generation, obviously they're not voting yet or expressing much in the way of an opinion in the mall, although if you talk to their mothers, they are. But anyway, that even in the high school world today is less materialistic and concerned about that kind of consumer excellence, to put a nice word to it, than their older counterparts. But I'm not denying that it exists, and the ability to get them engaged is often about using the technology, so well described by Alicia, in other ways of using their gadgets, their consumer gadgets, to do good work, and that's the other way you can get them there.
Research that we have seen by the Harvard Institute of Politics, Harvard School of Politics, indicates that in fact the less well-educated portion of that generation they may not be as easy to engage, they may not be quite as active, but they still do have the same basic mindset of their elders, of their better educated peers. They still have the same basic political values and same basic political beliefs, and surprisingly enough, given all of that, they're also about equally optimistic that they themselves are going to have good lives, that they themselves can make a difference in the world. I think it is a question of reaching them in the way that they live, and actually being able to mobilize that particular group maybe in a different way than those who are better educated. But the basic mindset and the basic optimism and progressivism is still the same, regardless in that generation.
In fact, some of the statistics we have in the book indicate that the Latino and African American millennials are more optimistic than their white peers about their future being better than their parents. Now, that's a different way of thinking about the future, and you can see why they might come to that conclusion. But regardless of education, they still hold that optimism. John?
Hold on, yeah, we're going to.
This is just a follow-up on that. Yet Alicia said that it's very hard to get that 2/3 to register to vote. 1 in 14, I thought you said.
To actually vote.
To actually register and vote.
To vote.
Well, and if they're feeling optimistic and positive and want to change things.
It's just harder to get to them. I mean, that's the problem. Colleges are such an easy place to go and to register a bulk of people, and you have other students on campus registering students. Where do you go? A bar, a nightclub? I mean, that's where we go. And the problem is you just can't get the same numbers there that you can get on college campuses. And there's not the same dialogue. That's the other difficulty.
If I could, we're going to turn the answer to this question over to a member of the audience. So sitting in the audience is a gentleman by the name of Mike Connery, who's written a book called Youth to Power, about the efforts of people to mobilize young folks. Since you've been in the middle of studying all this, you want to comment on this challenge? And especially on the bar crawl solution?
Sure, it is a challenge, and Alicia's right. You know, you don't necessarily get the best numbers at these bar crawls, but you do reach people that you would not have otherwise reached. If you go to concerts and register people, you reach people you wouldn't normally reach. There's a great group called Headcount, which is a 501c3, and they are very involved with musicians in certain music scenes, and they go to these concerts and they register voters. And in 04 and 06, I think they registered something like 60,000 voters for like $2 a voter. It's ridiculous how cost effective it is. And you can reach those people with these more culturally based outreach methods.
That if you're getting a phone call from a phone bank, that if it's another 18 to 29-year-old, you're going to assume that they are relating to you better than someone who's far outside of your age demographic. That door-to-door is done better with other 18 to 29-year-olds. The texting is done better with other 18 to 29-year-olds. But yeah, old school methods are still the best. It's just that it's not as quick or as efficient as some of the online. I mean, to put a link up on Facebook costs me nothing. To send a team out to do door-to-door, you know, there aren't people who volunteer anymore in the same way on campaigns. You know, I remember when I was working on a campaign in New Jersey and we went to campuses, I worked with Jess over here on it, funny, and they said, okay, well, we'll do door-to-door for $75 a day. And we said, well, you're volunteers. And they said, not for a camp. You know, they had gotten accustomed to on campaigns volunteering for money. So there's still, you know, I think what makes social networks and online stuff different is just the cost benefit. But you're absolutely right that doing on-the-ground field stuff is still go.
So we talk in the book about the studies that have been done that show that the youth has always been capable of being mobilized, but social network technologies and communication technologies that are peer-to-peer lower the cost of doing so dramatically, which is what Alicia has just talked about. The other issue there in the middle of all that, though, to respond to Mike's question or challenge, I'm not sure which it was, is this word we don't have, this thing we don't have a word for yet, which is taking online organizing and translating it into offline action. So net grassroots or something like that is a word that we're still trying to get to. I think Josh is the one who actually is trying to get to offline. I
created this word, online.
Offline, yes. Josh created. You might want to introduce yourself.
I don't
Josh.
know if that's a keeper, Josh. I'm
yeah,
not sure.
I never used your word for a lot of reasons, but the word is
offline activism.
Offline activism.
It's simple.
Josh is a.
If you have a hard time with it, then that's your problem.
But yeah, certainly not mine, right? It's in the Urban Dictionary now. But anyway, as Josh has pointed out, this combination is perhaps the most effective way to make all that happen when you can do both. And if you know, the most obvious example is, again, coming back to the Obama campaign, all of these 1.5 million now, I think, people on mybarackobama.com raising ungodly amounts of money, which are being spent, perhaps not wisely, on broadcast television, but also on offline grassroots activity. And in the book, we tell the stories of the very first examples of that. Congressional elections in 2006, campaigns for the state legislature in New Hampshire by millennials in the same year. And the formula is there. The execution of the formula is a much bigger challenge.
There's a very good piece in Rolling Stone, maybe 6 weeks ago, I think.
Not the one you wrote.
No, that was Mother Jones.
Oh, that was a very good piece.
Yeah, thank you. But it was in Rolling Stone about, and it's one of the only times the Obama campaign, you guys wrote about this on Tech President, but it's one of the only times the Obama campaign has given a window into this mix of the online, offline stuff. And so if anyone wants to follow up on that, it was by Tim Dickinson, I think, right? Tim Dickinson in Rolling Stone like 6 weeks ago. And it was a very good window.
And if you want to follow it daily, subscribe to Josh's Tech President Daily Digest. It's a really great online blog about all this going on.
John, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just add that this question about what's happening with the millennial generation that is college educated or that drops out of high school or that gets to college but finds that that they're not even prepared to succeed in college. I think this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue, not just socially in terms of education, which a lot of us are aware of, but it seems to me the risks are quite great to fracture and undermine the potential of this generation to be a force for kind of social good and political good over time. I mean, I think that in part expectations are higher, it seems to me, across the generations. We see it in our, kids in schools across the country. 10th, 11th graders are all expecting to go to college. And that is part of the kind of what their expectation is now. And then the majority of them either actually don't get there, or if they get there, they're not ready. And I think that the potential for even greater disillusionment and greater disconnection from being part of kind of a transformation of how we do things is really quite great. And then I think you add to that the fact that for all the students who don't graduate, you don't have the impact of all the incredible work that's been done on college campuses and online in the same way. And I think there's a potential for increased marginalization and disconnection in this generation, which could seriously undermine the potential of this generation to be kind of the force that we're talking about. So, of course, from my perspective, I think one of the most important things is to the urgency attached to actually closing the achievement gap in education, but also to think about how to, and I'd be interested in Alicia's perspective too, on given that, like, what do you think are the potential for dealing with that in the short and medium term around engaging kind of the full diverse generation? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, or others
I've got
do.
nothing. And I think, though, that the people at Circle have done the most research on that in terms of like how it could actually be integrated into our education system, such that when you do have kids, when you're looking at K through 12, that you can, put more of an emphasis on civic learning, on civic activism, on civic engagement in a way that we generally often wait until later in schooling to do.
And soon K-12 will be K to 14 from a government-sponsored perspective. That'll be part of the millennial generation's proposals. But we better let's get the audience back in here. Josh is holding the microphone.
So, is this on? Yeah, okay. I'm going to ask kind of a different kind of question. We've talked a lot about how people organize and the technological reasons why people who are feeling more engaged can get more engaged. But one, for me, like a big difference between the Gen X generation and the millennial generation is that the millennials have had two national traumas that have catalyzed them politically. Obviously 9/11 and the Iraq War. And we haven't heard that mentioned at all, really, tonight. So I'd be curious to know if you think that those are responsible for a generational shift, or if there's something else going on that causes these.
I think it's a combination of things. One of the things we've spoken about in our book is that realignments are generally brought about by some sort of triggering event, some sort of national trauma of one kind or another. So in 1860, for example, it was the whole question around slavery, whether it was specifically the Civil War or the general inability of the country to resolve that issue. Obviously, the Depression in the 1930s, the national social turmoil in the late 1960s, and so and I'm less convinced that it's Iraq than it is 9/11, which for this generation probably has the same impact that Pearl Harbor did for the GI generation. So that's a part of it. Those things do trigger, but it's also the characteristics of the generation itself, the way it is going to respond. And a particular type of generation that we refer to as a civic generation will usually respond in a manner to try to rebuild social institutions, to try to bring society, bring the polity together to resolve whatever the issues are that have been bothering us. Whereas usually when realignments occur as a result of a trauma, but in an idealist era, it ends up fracturing the country as the country goes in one direction or another. So I think those events are important, and it may well be that there were, the Gen X didn't produce a political realignment, so the same kind, there weren't those national traumas as that generation was growing up.
Alicia, you were in high school and college during all that, right?
It was my first day of college, September 11th, 2001.
So
Which is also scary because you have all these kids who are away from their parents for the first time ever. And especially the kids who weren't from the East Coast, wherever you were. New York City, Cambridge and New York City seemed a lot closer than LA or than Washington State. I would say a tertiary element to that, though, might be Hurricane Katrina. And I think we have yet to see how that will unfold, but I think because Katrina happened on our soil, and I think because were so many racial underpinnings in Hurricane Katrina. I mean, some people would say there was just, latent racism in Hurricane Katrina, but I think that will also spark a different type of interest in national affairs, because in the same way as September 11th and the Iraq War, what they've taught millennials, what they've taught at least my portion of that, which is the eldest millennials, I can't believe I'm the eldest anything, but the eldest millennials, is that who our national leaders are and who our national leaders are in a time of crisis can determine the direction of a country and whether something even becomes a crisis. So I think that people are looking very carefully at the president and at their choice for a president, not simply as someone who will have an agenda and move us forward, but who do we want in that moment of crisis to be making game time decisions. I do think that's a fundamental difference.
I think the point about Hurricane Katrina is a very good one and a very important one. And it really does speak to the era of an idealist era where people didn't really expect government, didn't believe the government was even capable of dealing with things like that. And the fact that John McCain would actually go to New Orleans and say, this isn't going to happen, never again is this going to happen, is really, I think, a reflection that even he and his party, or at least the way he wants to lead his party, may end up being much more civic than in its direction than the last several Republican administrations have been.
I also think it would be interesting, based on what you guys were saying about how we're so results oriented, to look at Iraq through that lens, through the fact that I think there's great frustration in this generation with the fact that there have been no results, like that we can't see anything and that we don't see improvement. So that we're examining social issues and foreign affairs through that, I think, as the ultimate measure of whether things are going well or things.
You're 100% right, Alicia. And one of the things that you hear all the time is, why aren't these kids out in the streets like the baby boomers were out in the streets with Vietnam? And they are, and aren't they as anti-war as we are? Well, they don't like this particular war. They think this particular war is stupid, not because they're pacifists, not because they necessarily think war is immoral or anything of that sort, but because they believe it isn't the right war. It's diverted our attention from other foreign issues that we need to deal with, and it's being prosecuted in a very bad manner, a very poor manner. And so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add to that. I think this direction is really important. I think it's going to be, this results orientation, seems to me, that we've seen, I think is going to be really positive for us in terms of ensuring accountability in government and politics. But it's really real and pay attention to. I think there's going to be less willingness to sort of stay with people, candidates, parties who are just saying the things that sound appealing. Now, there's always some identity politics, but I really think that there's going to be Katrina as an example, sense of total incompetence and failure, Iraq, and I think that those candidates, those governments, and the parties that ultimately aren't seen to be just delivering really practically on results that care about will suffer, and I think that's good, but it's also, I think, important to take note of.
Well, a very, very fundamental difference between the generations. Idealist generations like the boomers are generations of dreamers and talkers, and civic generations are generations of doers and builders. And the best way to think about that is to read Harry Potter, realize that everybody running Hogwarts is a boomer. They talk a lot, they never really decide anything, they do come up with some strange rules. Meanwhile, Harry Potter and his friends are saving the world, staying within the rules to the degree possible, but saving the world and getting things done by waving their magic wand. And every millennial believes they can do just that.
Do you have a wand, Alicia?
It's called Rock the Vote.
Two more quick ones. Yeah.
Oh, my question was on voter registration, but in brief, just regarding the difference between the Vietnam and Iraq War. Of course, we know that Iraq wouldn't last 10 minutes if there was a draft. And the special children.
I don't agree with that, by the way.
Well, I'll just say it, the special children that are raised, that you define there, I don't think there's one set of parents that would send their kids there for what was going on. And you talk about activities, marching in the streets and so forth, would be a different ballgame. But my question is about voter registration. The tremendous energies that go into getting people to register, young people, all people. Now you're finding a response in certain states for voter IDs. You had problems, of course, in Florida, well documented, where the rolls were eliminated, people went to vote, they weren't on the list. does Rock the Vote or the other organizations also deal with those legal issues?
Yeah,
You had one state that had same-day registration, which is wonderful. I think in Europe you don't have any registration in many countries. Are there any directions or trends in that direction?
Yeah, today, in fact, Indiana, there was a Supreme Court decision saying they're going to uphold voter ID, which is horrible for young people because it means, you know, I'm from New Jersey, so I have a New Jersey license. I go to school in Massachusetts, and if they had that, then I wouldn't be able to vote there necessarily because I'm not actually a Massachusetts citizen. So it imposes sort of all of these rules and regulations. Voting should be as easy as possible, and I think one of the things that's very specific to young voters, and this is not a millennial thing, this is a young voter thing, is that if your first experience voting is a positive one, then you will continue to vote throughout your life. If your first voting experience is a negative one, where someone says to you, you don't live here, you don't belong here, you're not supposed to be voting, then the chances of you coming back to vote in subsequent elections diminish. Which I think is significant, and I think that any barrier to voting is undemocratic, and that's certainly something that a lot of these groups, you know, it goes back to your idea about funding and how we have funding during on years and no funding during off years, but this is unfortunately something you really have to pick up during an off year to talk about legislation, rules and regulations around voting as a process. But yes, I think all of the groups in this room, including Gen Engage, and I mean, I just think everyone is invested in this issue.
Can I add one other thing to that is that really want to praise Howard Dean and the DNC for what they've done on this, because they had the foresight where all the state, you know that the election system in the United States is really a county-based system. And the DNC, starting, I think it was almost a year ago, or maybe 9 months ago, had all the county parties go and actually interview on the record all the registrars and the voting chiefs in every single state and every single county in the country to understand their interpretation of the rules a year and a half out, so that legal action could be taken if necessary a year out, not, because in essence the way that Democrats and progressives have viewed this is that it's sort of voter protection, which is exactly the wrong way to be looking at this actually, because what it is that it's not about election day, it's about what happens, as we've learned in recent years, about the strategic and systemic effort by the Republican Party over the last 2 generations to disenfranchise people in every single election in virtually every state in the country. It's a national strategy of one of the 2 political parties to prevent people from voting, right? And I don't think the media and frankly a lot of elites have actually come to understand this, that this is a strategic effort to the point where it's actually took down Alberto Gonzalez and everything else in recent days. Dean really understood this and has done more at the DNC than any group probably in the history of politics in the last 2 years to really try to anticipate, understand, and take action long in advance. And so for those of you who are DNC donors, some of that money you've given has gone to really incredibly far-sighted and thoughtful ways of attacking this problem. And I applaud him for that. Last question. Go ahead.
I had a quick question, sorry.
Speak.
My question was referring back to the conversation about online using of technology going offline or offline, as you said. I'll try to use that term. And I just wondered, I mean, it seems like one of the most striking aspects of this presidential election has been the intra-generational conversations about politics. I mean, no one in my family ever had, I mean, we are all speaking constantly. I think of politics as in some ways, in my family used to be more like religion and sex, things you just didn't talk about with your family members, and it seems that there's been a real turn towards intergenerational conversations that have been meaningful, and just looking at endorsements and how many people have said their daughters or their sons, et cetera. And I just wondered, is that something that you think is going to continue? Is that part of the millennial contribution to politics, and is it something that you think is going to continue, and is it something also that you're able to measure or look at as a factor in politics?
Well, I think it will continue for this particular generation, for this type of generation, that you will, because they get along with their parents, and so that you will have this intergeneration discussion, agreement, both generations influencing one another in a positive way, as frequently the younger generation influencing the older as vice versa. But if we are correct about these changes in generational cycles, the millennials will rear a generation yet to be unnamed of baby boomers, whatever they're going to be called, and they will fight with their parents. And so it will go back in the other direction again, and people will be arguing and screaming about politics. So Michael Stivic meathead will be arguing with this generation's Archie Bunker in some way.
But our kids will still be really special.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
And
Just not as special.
Actually, that will be the problem. You will indulge them, and indulged kids, which is what boomers were, raised by civic GIs, turn into rebellious kids. So that's the other.
Why don't we just go around final thoughts, everybody, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'm really, this gentleman was anxious to ask.
Please go ahead. We'll sneak one more in. We try to be on time in our
Yeah, I
events,
understand.
by the way.
Millennials might be results driven, and they might be about efficiency and affecting change. But at the same time, I mean, we also grew up in a culture of instant gratification. It's a culture where I got an iPhone and a BlackBerry, and I was texting my friend 5 times before I got here because he didn't answer me. I want instant gratification right away. That's a characteristic of our generation. Now, are we setting ourselves up to fail anyway? Because sustainable social change require, a lot of groundwork and community mobilization, especially in this diverse community. So how do we?
So why don't we both answer that question and give our last thoughts?
Absolutely.
We'll start with Alicia.
Oh, that's nice.
Thank you. You don't want to be first?
No, I think, I'm not sure that, I don't think that's played out yet. Like, I don't think we've seen the ways in which, legislation's a process, and I think if we all think that it's going to happen instantly, then we're wildly misled. But I do think that part of what's been great is, this generation that's grown up with blogs and with instant information that they can get. And I think that we really are seeing a very well-informed generation. So while I'm not sure how that necessarily translates into action when it comes to the government, I think that is actually one of the final frontiers of all of this, is government actually thinking about how they can use the blogosphere, how they can use all of these civic tools to actually engage the public in formatting legislation and pushing through legislation. If Barack Obama does become the nominee and then does become president, he will have a list of millions of people who he could then activate for specific pieces of legislation that they can call their congressmen, their legislators, their peers to call their congressmen and their legislators, and that would fundamentally change civic organizations forever. But I think it will actually take some top-down organization to see that happen. My final thoughts are stay tuned. This is going to be an incredibly interesting election. It is only getting started. If you know anyone 18 to 29 who is not registered to vote, please tell them to go to rockthevote.com. I mean that seriously. Anyone who just got married and changed their name, anyone who's moved, anyone who wants to move somewhere, let them know, because that is sort of the #1 tool that you can give people. Once they're registered, everyone's going to want to vote in this election. So thank you.
And I'm going to split up.
I am special.
I know you are. and I love the fact that you're special. So I'm going to let Mike do final thought, and I'm going to respond along Alicia's dimensions with the impact on government, which is exactly what she said. Think about Wikipedia government. It's already been tried in the state of Utah in the last legislative session in a site called Politicopia, in which the citizens were allowed to participate in the legislative debate and inform the debate. They changed legislative minds. So even though the results may take a while, the process of getting to those results will be as dramatically different this next decade as the New Deal was in the 1930s.
Okay, and I guess my final thoughts would be, I'm going to maybe up Alicia 1 by saying not only is this election going to be interesting, but the next 40 years are going to be very interesting for this country. If you think back to what it might have looked like in 1932, things were worse, much worse than they are now. And the country, because of a new generation, because it was willing to move forward and was a results-oriented, optimistic generation, made the changes that were necessary. It wasn't easy, and we went through a couple of even worse years after Roosevelt was elected. Then, as things began to improve, we obviously had to go through decades of global conflict. But I am still very confident that the way this generation operates, it is going to be able to resolve the issues that are confronting us, and the country will come out on the back end stronger than it is now.
John.
It's a great question, and to me, it gets at my closing comment. This book is such an important book, I think, and this topic is such an important topic to go deep in and think about what are the implications, not only for the short term, but for what we as a country need to do in the next several years. I think it's this generation and this impulse that we're seeing, I think is going to put some very healthy pressure on political leaders, on political institutions and government to do some things very differently than we've done. And I think that's really good. And I think it's really important to get ahead of that. I think for your question, I think it's going to put a premium on leadership and management to be able to both get results and to be able to effectively communicate in ways that help people understand what the steps are along the way to get to those results. I think that this is going to demand political leadership that is willing to go against often some traditional interests in the pursuit of getting these kind of results. If we had time, we could talk about that on education and some of the issues that I think are there that are going to be very important for effective leaders to say, you know what, we're going to have to sort of scramble what some interest groups have traditionally expected in order to be able to work in new ways in order to get results. So I think the demands for better political leadership and management are going to be huge, not only to get a better society, but in order to keep getting elected and reelected. And I think that your question gets that. I think it's really healthy, and it's one of the great responsibilities that we'll all have.
And I'll close just by saying that as we look forward, next Monday, we're going to continue this conversation with Rob Shapiro, a very good old friend of Morley's, who's written a really wonderful book called Futurecast, which looks at 3 very large global trends and how they're going to shape the world over the next 15 years. Globalization, the arrival of America as the sole superpower in the world, and also enormous demographic changes that are reshaping the world, which I think all of these big trends will be informing and influencing some of the conversation we'll have tonight. So please come back if you can. Next Monday, I'll be here as well. And I think that one of the things that Rob and I have worked, and I just want to add one final thought to everything that was raised tonight about this issue, John, that you were talking about the potential divide. And sort of the question was, will the hopes and aspirations of this generation be met by by what happens in the real world? And I think one of the great governing challenges that we face, which Rob and I have been writing about quite a bit at NDN, and which is a central part of Rob's book, is this issue of how does one restore broad-based prosperity in a global age. We've had high GDP growth, high productivity growth in recent years. We've had wages be flat, income go down. There are unprecedented economic circumstances that we're facing as a country. And I think that one of the challenges is going to be is that are we going to be able to provide this generation with the same kind of economic opportunities that previous generations have had? And on that score, they're actually very pessimistic, right? There is general pessimism in the American electorate today about the economic opportunities, perhaps not the societal, perhaps not some of the other ones. And that is going to be a central theme and discussion of what we're going to talk about next Monday night here if you'd like to come. But I want to say thanks to this remarkable panel. Make sure you check out New Leaders for New Schools. Make sure you buy Morley and Mike's book outside. And if there are no more left, because we've had a lot of demand, Amazon.com or your favorite bookstore.
Tracy's found some.
And help rock the vote with Alicia. But thank you all very much for being here.